He had never seen this part of the country before. He watched as the rain fell in a dull drizzle across the windshield of the car. He could see little of the countryside around him except when the occasional flash of lightning turned the sky bright pale blue. It had been a month since his life had so drastically altered for what he considered to be the worse. It had been that long since his brief meeting with a dying woman in an alley had upset the entire balance of his existence. Her name had been Angel, and he had seen her many times on various television programs concerning psychic healers and unexplained phenomena. She could cure the sick and heal the injured with a touch. She had gathered around her a small following of believers and began what could only be considered a strange underground revolution. She had said many controversial things, outing many important figures in the business world. She had claimed that there were cults of evildoers operating in secret all over the world. If it hadn't been for the fact that most people thought of her as some sort of phone line psychic nut job, then her life probably would have ended a lot sooner. However, people had begun to listen, and eventually her enemies could not help but react. She had been beaten and stabbed when Kurt found her. She lay semi-conscious in a pool of blood, gasping for air with a punctured lung. He had bent down to help her, and that was when she touched him. Exactly what she had done, he did not realize for days. To his bitter realization, it occurred to him in the following week that Angel Love, the weirdo psychic freak from primetime television, had healed him. Kurt's particular sickness was his choice of lifestyle. He was 37 years old and living on the streets of Portland. He did not work, or in fact do anything constructive or meaningful. He had considered himself an explorer of the mind, and early on, this had led him to experimentation with various substances. This experimentation eventually led to his dependency on these same substances. Although he had not considered himself sick, it had become somewhat apparent that he was suffering from a disease, an affliction of his spirit that was gradually eating away at his body, mind, and soul. After Angel had touched him, he was free, but this freedom came at a price. She had also given him a gift, or so his dreams had told him. It was these dreams and nightmares that had set him on his long drive south to a swamp where no one had set foot for decades. This reoccurring vision had guided him to a place that he was finding more and more familiar with the passing of each mile. He had asked the strange voice in his visions exactly what he was supposed to do, and what this gift he was supposed to possess was. His only response was to be driven onward, to all he had seen in the dream, the submerged house from his visions, the decayed mansion covered in vines rising out of a great lake of stagnant black water. The old man at the library had told him the name. The old librarian had collected decades of news clippings concerning the forgotten place. Kurt traveled to the lost love mansion, abandoned and left to rot like a carcass in the marsh. Just as the old man had said, there was a path hidden by years of undergrowth off to the side of the muddy gravel road. Originally, there had stood 2 granite pedestals on each side of the road on which stone serpents sat proudly guarding the long path to the house. One of these pedestals had fallen and been buried by years of vegetation and erosion, but the other still stood 10 feet from the road. Kurt could see it in the headlights as he parked. He rifled through his bag and withdrew his flashlight. From the back seat, he withdrew the small inflatable raft that he was sure to need if he was to complete his task. The rain had changed to a mist as he trudged towards the trees. He wished that this could have all been done during the day, but he knew that whatever he was supposed to do had to be accomplished now in the dark of night. On the ground beneath the soil and weeds, he could see the remnant of what was a stone walk. 100 years ago, there had been a stone wall around what was the Love Estate. A gate had stood between the stone pillars leading to a long cobblestone walk that crossed the great lands. This place had been a paradise for the Loves, like a Garden of Eden financed by all manner of illegal activities. Philip Love, the last patron of the family to reside in this place with his family before its fall in 1931, had made a fortune from bootlegging and smuggling. Until his disappearance, he had lived a life of luxury and obsessive secrecy. Kurt trudged along through the undergrowth, his flashlight helping little to see through the continuing drizzle. Gradually, the ground became increasingly muddy, and his tennis shoes began to sink into the muck as he struggled to maintain his march. In time, he found himself wading waist-deep in cold, dark water. He shuddered as unseen things moved languidly against his legs, and withdrew the bundle tied to his backpack. The roll of tarp held a small device, and as he pulled the cord, the raft automatically inflated itself. He struggled into the raft and assembled the oar before beginning to paddle onward. He could see the black moss-covered limbs rising gnarled and twisted from the water. He shook with fear as he saw movement along the many of the branches. Panic began to take hold as his flashlight caught the first sign of the snakes swimming in almost every visible area. There were hundreds, maybe even thousands, floating all around him. His flashlight reflected off of their cold eyes as they gazed at him from the swamp. Even now, he could not configure any logical explanation as to why he was here. Yet within him was a need to continue. He could no longer gauge how deep the water beneath him was, but as he paddled into what appeared to be a clearing, he gasped at what a flash of lightning revealed. Before him, emerging from the undergrowth, and the black lake in which he floated helplessly, was what remained of the Love Mansion. The swamp had claimed it for its own, but still quite visible was the great walls and balcony. He made his way slowly across the expanse of the water until his route along the front wall of the house brought him to the entrance. Its doors torn away by time, the upper arc of the entrance cleared the surface of the water by 3 feet, and beneath it he drifted onward into the ancient rotted structure. Inside, his head was only an arm's length from a ceiling that long ago had towered 20 feet from the floor below. This floor now was all but invisible beneath his raft as he shone the light in his trembling cold hands around the interior. Even here the serpents had invaded, and their black bodies were visible in every corner of the huge room. In the distance he saw a stairway rising from the murky depth and on into the upper floors of the house. He carefully paddled across the chamber until his raft bounced lightly off the staircase. The stairs were made of pure marble, which explained their resilience to the elements. He crawled from the raft and began to ascend. Moss hung in dark green clumps to every surface as the long black snakes writhed in the corners of the stone. Here he felt the presence he had so long cowered from in his nightmares, this great dark energy that had called to him from some hidden place of the mass unconscious. As he climbed, he saw a sight directly from his many dreams. The first door to the left was still intact and closed for all these many years. He reached out, touching the cold rusted metal of the doorknob, holding his breath, and now shaking hysterically, he turned it and opened the passage. Within there was cold. His body jerked as the blast of freezing, death-like air hit him. He held his eyes wide open and forced himself to look in. Long ago there had been velvet curtains hanging in the great scenic window. Flowers had sat neatly arranged on the massive oaken table, and the huge canopy bed had lain in the center against the far wall covered in warm, rich fabrics and perfumed sheets. This had been some lady's room. Some elegant woman from some past time had spent long hours reading upon the soft red couch. However, now all was still from the decades of unending black darkness. He walked slowly, the floor carpeted in fine rugs still firm beneath his feet. He turned his light upon the bed, and he shook to see that the blankets were tousled and unmade as if someone had just arisen from slumber. Again, he moved the light along the wall until it settled onto a large painting hanging over the fireplace. There was the elegant lady just as he had seen within his imaginings. She was pale and dressed as if from 5 decades past. Her long black hair lay shining on thin, frail shoulders. There was something so familiar about her shining green eyes that he thought he even recognized the silent mouth and the shape of her otherworldly, ethereal face. This was not some ancient, forgotten relative of the television psychic. This was Angel's mother, staring at him from the wall of this long, hidden chamber. This had been her room, and to the side of the bed, laying upon its side on the floor, as it had for all these long years, was a cradle. Somewhere inside him, all his dreams pooled and erupted forth into his conscious mind. There came a voice speaking, at a low whisper at first, but rising with every syllable. "He took her from me," it said. "He took her from me so long ago, and saved her." They say that the mind and body must coexist. For instance, if one were to slumber for too long, then the mind, after its required rest, will awaken of its own accord and begin pondering reality as dreams. After a longer duration, if the body remains sleeping, the mind will travel and surge ever further inward into itself until it begins pulling forth those hidden deep emotions. In time, it will brood over long periods on dark fears and desires. So begin nightmares. The body will then awaken, but the mind, after surveying these things for so long, becomes sluggish and inactive in the waking world. Even with the body being awakened, the mind is still delving inward and downward into dark caverns of the unconscious. In the same way, if one were not to let the body rest, then the exhausted mind would shut itself down and sleep. A person in such a state begins to comprehend and focus less and less on the current surrounding reality. The wall that the active brain creates to hold the inward world at bay deteriorates in the dark inner depths. The nightmares begin to submerge and intermingle with our conscious thoughts. Having told you this much, I shall explain even further. Within our family, we have long held a belief that there is a much deeper, much darker place that oneself may venture to. A dark country, a place hidden even to the most probing and curious human brain. It lay beneath our simple fears and paranoias. It is like a great black ocean in which there exist ancient and powerful entities. They are entities that our conscious reckoning has only glimpsed over the millennia. These gods and demons have lurked in shadows, hiding their secrets since the dawn of time. We have believed in this knowledge and passed it on since all time recorded that certain individuals, either by choice or by bizarre incident, can emerge from this passage and cross the boundary into new and temporal realities. Once here, they may use an individual, possess them if you will, and begin affecting the material plane. One such individual was a young man named Stephen Aldry, known to you and the others of this world as the leader of the Full Moon Cult. How could a simple man be responsible for such atrocities? That is what they asked when after 12 years they finally captured the mass murderer and cult leader, Stephen Aldry. This man whose body count had numbered in the hundreds, a depraved and diseased mind that, without conscience, slaughtered men, women, and children without discrimination or remorse. He sat outside the maximum security prison, waiting in the cold white exam room. They wanted to talk to him, to describe his feelings, and above all else, to give a reason. Why? Why did he kill so many people in such a brutal, inhuman fashion? The world was filled with normal, rational people who desired to know what lurks inside the mind of a person like that. They long to understand the reasoning, if any. Was it out of hatred? Did he kill to satisfy some sick sexual desire? This man had traveled the United States far and wide on the highways and back roads, senselessly killing for 12 long years. Here he sat bound and still, his face a morbid, emotionless mask, awaiting another endless barrage of questioning from another expert analyst. Stephen, if you don't talk to us, how can we help? The cold blonde woman with the purple lipstick asked, as she stared intently into the man's sunken, empty eyes. His long black hair hung over his emaciated frame, as the thin lips hidden beneath a thick braided beard said nothing. Stephen, you have to open up. Don't you want people to know your story? Don't you want people to understand? It was the third day of his questioning at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday when he finally spoke to the pale-skinned woman with her over-hair-sprayed, bleached blonde hair and ridiculous amounts of foundation and mascara. You wear too much makeup, he said flatly, his voice raspy and low. What? She'd been taken aback by the first words she had heard him speak to date. Makeup. You wear quite a bit. You look like a clown or a prostitute. Possibly a combination thereof. Stephen, we're not here to talk about me, she said quickly, regaining her composure and now leaning forward with greedy, intent expression as the tape recorder on the table consumed every noise in the room. Tell me about yourself. Tell me when all this started. I guess there are a lot of people who would love to change, to look different, to be different, or maybe just wear a mask like you. Well, yes, Stephen. There's a lot of people who are uncomfortable with the way they were born. Are you uncomfortable with your appearance? Uncomfortable? No, I wouldn't say that. Maybe slightly confused. What do you mean, confused? Are you talking about your sexuality? No, I'm talking about identity, history, and perception, Doctor. So, you don't understand yourself, is that what you're trying to say? I feel trapped. Well, that is to be expected. You are in a prison. I feel trapped inside a nightmare, and all I want is some way out. You want to die? Why is that? If I told you, you wouldn't believe me. You're going to have to trust me, Stephen. I can't help you if you don't trust me. I trust you more than what you think. It's easy to trust when you know what people's motives are. Then you know what to trust people with. And what are my motives, Stephen? There are many. You want to be famous. You want to be a success at your career. You want to write a book about me, have it be a bestseller. If you happen to help me in the process, it wouldn't bother you. But I truly doubt if that is your main concern. However, this is your lucky day, since I feel like talking. I feel like helping you, Doctor. So let's talk. In fact, let's talk about wolves. Did you know that thousands of years ago, there were these giant wolves? We refer to them as dire wolves now. They ruled this continent. They were efficient, monstrous killers, the likes of which you probably can't even imagine. They were the size of men and almost as cunning, hunting only the largest, most dangerous prey. Their gray cousins cowered at their presence and their might. They sat rightfully at the top of the prehistoric food chain for centuries uncounted. Their packs were enormous and prospered throughout all the long years of the Ice Age. You might think that when man came, all this ended, but you'd be wrong. The direwolves were not threatened by us in the least. We feared them greatly, you see. They did not flee from our presence like their smaller kin. Our spears and fire meant little to them. They did not fear injury or death. These beasts did not fear the bear, the tiger, and most certainly did not fear the pale, starving men who wandered across the ice bridge. The dire wolves began to hunt us. The first tribes that found their way here paid them tribute and eventually began to worship them. They served the wolves, and in return, the wolves let them survive. This relationship was all but harmonious, indeed, as goes all relationships between man and his gods. That's what they were, our gods. We emulated them, we sacrificed to them, but still, in the dark months of winter, they fed on us. The bond between the first tribes and the wolves grew so close that the men had begun to believe that they themselves were wolves trapped in a different form. Finally, when more groups crossed the bridge and came to this land, they were met by an older, more sinister clan of natives. The Wolf Clan did not see these newcomers as kindred. To the Wolf Clan, the newcomers were weak, diseased intruders, and they joined the packs of great wolves in the hunting, slaying, and devouring of fellow humans. Over the course of centuries, a war was fought between the new tribes and the old Wolf Clan. However, the newcomers had one thing on their side that brought about the downfall of all who hunted them. Their very flesh was a weapon. They carried plagues and disease that soon infected all that feasted on their bodies. The packs of both men and wolf rotted in their dens and camps. The wolf shamans gathered and foretold the end of their race. They would all die side by side with their gods. The cannibal tribes withered in the endless winters until only a few remained. They gathered the bodies and bones of the wolves they found. These they burned on great pyres for all the heavens to see, and in their minds they saw the smoke as carrying the souls of their kin, man and wolf alike, into the sky to be joined. At the end of the last winter, the last tribe gave birth to 6 infants. The shamans sent these children with their weeping mothers across the plains to the camps of the new tribes which had brought their extermination. The mothers held out the silent, stoic babes to the tall, dark hunters who, out of pity, accepted them. Consequently, 3 boys and 3 girls were adopted into their camp. They were raised amongst the new, prospering tribes as, unbeknownst to them, their parents and gods died in the wilderness. Only in their deepest, darkest dreams did they even glimpse the truth of their origin. So what are you trying to tell me, Stephen? That you're a wolf, trapped inside a man's body? Is that what you believe? He stared at her and for the first time since his capture, smiled. No, ma'am. And that would be just silly now, wouldn't it? Then what are you trying to say? I'm just saying it's an interesting story. Where did you hear that story, Stephen? It's not a story I was told, but one that I learned. A story that was written in my blood. I grew up in the desert. My mom was a full-blooded Comanche, and my father was just some guy who I never met. The Comanche are proud people inhabiting the same areas as dozens of other tribes, but no native nation is the same. A lot of settlers would have said they were bloodthirsty, but a lot of Indians would have said the same about the settlers. It's funny how history just repeats itself over and over. There are always these newcomers wiping out the natives, aren't there? So my mom was a Native American, but I didn't grow up on a reservation. I grew up in the city. Mom worked constantly, as most single moms do, and I kind of raised myself. Fell in with some pretty bad people when I was very young, and when I was 13 I started doing drugs. I've never really been able to understand if drugs are good or bad. I guess they're both, actually. Throughout history, every culture's used them. But in the beginning, they were all ritual and religion. Moreover, they are party favors, a snack for your psyche, a disease that you just can't shake, and a demon that devours your mind and existence. It was 1969. Anton LaVey established the Church of Satan in California. Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix were at their peak, and I was wandering the streets of the city, stoned out of my mind, while thousands of soldiers were rotting in Vietnam. A climax had been reached in this country, and the come down was going to be unrelenting. I used to wander out to the reservations, which were little more than trailer parks back then, to see my grandfather. I would sit high as a kite and listen as he told me stories of the old days. I had a favorite tale, though. I consider it to be one of the most interesting bits of Native American folklore. They tell stories about skinwalkers, that is, men who walk in the flesh of animals. Then again, every culture has these tales. One night, there was a party in the desert, and all the hippies had their vans in a circle like a wagon camp back in the days of the pioneers. There was a fire. I remember that. A huge blaze like a funeral pyre. I was so wasted, I could barely talk, and the music was playing loud, so I stumbled around dancing and laughing while somewhere Charles Manson was sitting by a fire, contemplating some very strange ideas. Deep into the night, a song started to play off someone's radio as I walked into the shadows by myself for no apparent reason. It was Hush by Deep Purple. I had chewed on peyote since noon. The stars were whirling like a bright cyclone of blurred pinpoint dots, and the desert sand looked like snow. I kept thinking about the long winters and what it would feel like to starve alone in a cold, frozen place with no one to help or feed you. Then my eyes focused on one bright, shining beacon in the clear desert sky. I noticed for the first time that night that the moon was full. And then all went dark. I woke in the morning laying naked in the hot, biting sand. The sun beat down on me as I raised myself to my knees, and I looked around and saw the circle of vans still parked in the distance. Grateful there would be someone to take me home, I began to walk, chuckling to myself at my situation. As I got closer, I noticed that all was quiet. I assumed everyone was passed out as I had been. I was mistaken. There was blood. Ripped flesh, bodies torn and ravaged, vultures pecking and feasting, flies buzzing in clouds over the remains. This is what I found as I entered the circle. Everyone was dead. I could see hulks of bloodied waste lying in piles in the distance. Some had run and been caught. I looked down at my naked body and saw that I was painted red in the sun. My entire body covered in crimson. I turned and walked back into the desert alone. And that was how it began, back in 1969. As time passed, the reasons began to appear. My dreams answered my questions, and eventually I knew all there was to know about what had happened that night. A great power had taken form, and I was its gate, its slave. It would never leave me, and eventually it would change me, become me. Do you believe that, Stephen? That you killed all those people by yourself in one night? Believe that? Oh no, Doctor. That'd be crazy. Even if it was true, didn't you want to help? Oh yeah, very much so. For the first few years, all I did was look for help. Everywhere I went, there were murders and carnage, but who can heal a sick spirit? God. This thing is a god, and I was just its puppet. In 1979, exactly 10 years later, I found myself in Louisiana. I talked to all manner of charlatans and voodoo priests looking for some answer. Voodoo is all about possession by your gods. No one knew the answer. No one could help. This thing wanted vengeance. In essence, it is a god of revenge. It was that longing, that desire, that had created the spirit that held me captive. This thing had gone from a hunter to a raging machine of destruction. Its appetite was bottomless and could not be slaked, no matter how many died. It didn't seek out the lone stranger in the night. It sought the gatherings, the groups. It wanted to destroy tribes, and that's what it looked for. So I sought isolation, as I've always. I was alone, hiding from the crowds when the moon was full. And as the years passed, I realized I couldn't stop it. What about the drugs, Stephen? Did you keep using drugs? Well, I found out something about the drugs I had used. They could trigger these changes, even when the moon wasn't full. Now, let me tell you about Maxine. Maxine? Who is that? Maxine Love. Deep in the swamp, there's an enormous house that's been sitting there since the 1920s or 30s. The family that built it was called the Loves. From what I understand, they were reclusive Dutch immigrants. The house had a very bad reputation. The family had a reputation for black magic. Very bad mojo in that place, people said. The entire family had died out except for one last descendant, and she had not been seen since her arrival in the town 20 years previous, when she was 7 years old, brought there by her brother, who had found her in a foster home and taken custody. They had not been heard of since. I wouldn't have cared or even known if it hadn't been for fate. As you know, I was being hunted all over the country, and despite my efforts, my trail was very easy to follow. Detectives tracked me to a hotel in a town called Mossboro in Mississippi. It was springtime and in the height of the full moon. There were more police outside than I could even count. Inside me, it wanted out. I didn't fear the police. I feared for the police. There was no place to run, no place to hide. They kept yelling on the blowhorns as the sun began to sink. I didn't have a gun, but they thought I was armed when they stormed my room. They had evacuated the hotel, so they didn't concern themselves with trivial talk. They just came in. The moon and the sun both could be seen still. I remember that. The sun was sinking and the moon rising. They told me to get down, but I had no control at that point. The change had started. I could feel my body tearing and throbbing, my heart pounding as pure unfiltered rage filled every corner of my mind and heart. They were confused and soon terrified. They opened fire, and the bullets ripped into my flesh like sharp needles. There is no way to control the beast once it awakens. It destroys and obliterates all in its path. What happened after that, I do not know. A week later, I read in a newspaper that the hotel had burned down, and the death toll was still disputed. The cops who survived couldn't make heads nor tails of what had happened. I've learned over the years that people do not trust themselves and what they see. I know they saw me, and I'm sure late at night in bars and over card tables, the survivors speak in uncomfortable whispers about the stress-induced hallucinations they had on that night. But none believe when they see the beast. That would be insane. At the crack of dawn, 3 days later, I awakened in the swamp, my body still ripped and bleeding from countless gunshot wounds. They were healing, though, At an unbelievable rate. I knew it would take days to recover. I could barely walk. My head was bleeding from a bullet buried deep in my skull. That's right. Even a bullet to the head can't do it. I've had shotguns blast my heart out of my chest like a cannon, and still lay in some dark alley healing. The energy that keeps me alive comes from some other realm or dimension where the gods live. I'm not sure that I can die. I shot myself in the head when I was 21 with a silver bullet. Hurt like hell. I was unconscious for 2 days, but it was no different than any other bullet. I've never had the guts to toss myself into a barrel of acid or anything. I think it would just be too painful. Take too long. Especially if it didn't work. The head wounds always leave me like a zombie. I can't think or speak. That morning, one side of my body was paralyzed as I dragged myself through the mud to a patch of swamp grass. My hand was mangled, and I was missing fingers. Some cop had fired a few rounds into my crotch. I've been shot by police a dozen times, and someone always shoots for the groin. The beast doesn't help to ease the pain of these recoveries. I feel it all. I would have screamed, but my lungs were collapsed and destroyed. I was still conscious, still awake. I could see in a blurred segments. I could hear something behind me. The shape was gray and pale like a ghost. Then I saw a face in the whirl of faded color. It was a woman. She said very distinctly into my ear, "I've been waiting for you." The voice was so soothing that just those words sent me to a deep, calm sleep. Thankfully, all the pain was gone. When I awoke again, my vision had returned. I was in a huge, stately bedroom in a massive canopy bed. The windows were open and outside it poured a dreary, overcast rain. There were blackbirds gathered outside the window on the railing of a balcony. They stared at me and squawked to each other as if discussing my presence. Sitting in a chair beside a dimly burning fireplace was the woman from the swamp. She was cold white with black hair and shimmering green eyes like emeralds. "You are awake," she said quietly. "How long have I been out?" I asked, sitting up and gazing at my almost healed body. "A week. You haven't been very good company." "No, sorry. But where am I?" "Someplace safe and hidden. This is the Love Mansion." "So you've heard of it," she said, smiling slightly. "In town, the voodoo people talk about it." "The voodoo people? That's interesting. What do they say?" "That you shouldn't come here." "Well, that would be good advice for one of them, maybe, but not for you. You belong here." "Miss, I don't belong anywhere." "Oh, that's right. You're the full moon killer, the mass murderer, the serial killer that no one can catch and no one comprehends. Why don't you tell me, Stephen? How did you kill all those people? The police just can't figure it out. They say you must have the homicidal strength of a madman or be the leader of a cult of killers. I don't see any cult members with you. Are they waiting in the swamp?" "You ask all the wrong questions, and you don't need any answers." With that, I rose from the bed and began to walk to the door, which I found locked. "Ma'am, you don't want me here." I turned on her. "I don't know what you're doing, but I need to go. They are following me." "No, they're not, Stephen. They found a body in the wreckage of the hotel they think is you. Their wishful thinking has led them to believe so. For a time, you are free." "For a time? Until when?" "My guess is until the next full moon, if I'm correct. The beast is quick, isn't it? That's why they can't catch you. It takes you miles and miles away and leaves you alone in some desolate wilderness. It hides you, doesn't it? Like a precious possession that it must guard. Yes, I would guess that it protects you in its way. It heals you. It makes you cunning. How do you know all this? I've been talking in my sleep. I know a lot about you, Stephen, but first let me introduce myself. My name is Maxine Love, and I've been waiting for you for a very long time. You are not the only one in this world plagued by a demon. There is one here as well, and with your help, I will be free of it. As she said this, she reached out a frail, icy hand and touched my arm. How can I free you of your demon when I am a slave to my own? There are ways. In fact, there is a ritual. A ritual? What are you, another voodoo priest? Voodoo, no. But I am a priestess of a far older spirit, one of the ancient entities. It is an evil so old and wicked that it had consumed my family for generations. Its worshippers fled Europe a century ago, and the remnants of that sect settled here in this house. I was born here, Stephen, but I barely knew my parents. I was raised in foster homes until finally my older brother found me and brought me here in this care. I had thought that he was my savior, but instead, he condemned me. He taught me the old ways of this sick and twisted art. I have great power, Stephen, just as you. And like you, I long to be free. You can help me. I need another, and my dreams told me of you since I was a child. And I first heard that alien voice rise up from the waters of the lake. I have lived in fear of him. Him. It speaks to you. Yes, indeed. It has great intelligence and spite. He is a serpent, a dragon, and a man. A serpent, like the devil? Older, far older than any Christian belief. The Christian Satan mirrors him, echoes him, but his origins are buried deep in the history of man. He is a healer, an oracle, and a killer. He controls life and death, but most of all the flesh, which he controls and contorts to his will. He grants a perverted immortality. What? I don't understand. Come with me then, and I will show you. She led me through the mansion and down a winding staircase and on to a back chamber hidden and secret. Here an enormous door waited locked and bolted by iron locks. She carried a lantern and withdrew an ancient rusted key that hung from her waist. She looked at me imploringly and unbolted the door. It led down into a dark cellar, and we followed cracked stone stairs into the foul darkness. The air was thick and damp, filled with a humid, rotting scent. We entered a great chamber where she began to light candles, and in the shadows, I heard wrestling and dragging, the sound of chains, and a strange guttural hiss. Do not be frightened when you see him. See what? I asked, as she gestured to a far corner of the cellar behind what appeared to be a huge stone table with symbols and markings carved into it. My brother, she said, as she aimed the lantern into the darkness. He stood chained to the wall by enormous iron shackles with his tattered, ragged clothing barely covering a hideously disfigured human form. Even rotted and stinking, his body writhed and contorted against the chains. His flesh, though still human for the most part, held patches of gray-green scales shining in the lantern's glow. His face, although recognizable as a man, was elongated slightly, his eyes slitted, lidless and serpentine. He stared quietly for a moment, and then, in one burst of rage, his jaw opened to an unnatural length, and huge dripping fangs became visible over a long, writhing, forked tongue. "Oh my God!" I screamed and fell back. "What happened to him? What is this insanity? He's an abomination!" Yes, exactly. an abomination, Stephen. He died when I was 17. He told me that if anything should ever happen, I was to chain his body to that wall for my own safety. I was so close to not listening, but when his body began to move, I heeded his warning. This is the result of his worship, of his ritual. He discovered the old ways here in this house and used them to gain immortality. This is it. This is his immortality. The body was possessed by the spirit of a serpent. And now here he is alive, but still dead for an eternity bound to this earth. There is no peace for him, no rest. He starves for flesh eternally. But what of you, then? Why don't you just leave, Maxine? Because this is the fate which awaits me. The fate which he was trying to prevent. My family is cursed in death, and the ritual was to end it, but failed. I didn't even understand what we were doing. I did everything he said unquestioningly. This fate awaits me. I too will be cursed just as he. I am as doomed as this thing hanging on the wall. Tears ran down her face as her hands shook violently. What can I do? I don't understand any of this. I am as doomed as you. No, there is a way. I found it in the old books that my family had sealed here. We can purify ourselves. What? How? You must return here as often as you can for as long as it takes. We must make love on the altar during the ritual after I have spoken the chant. It can work. It must. No, this is too much. It can't possibly work. Please, believe me. And did you believe her? The doctor whispered breathlessly. Of course not. That'd be insane. She was beautiful. You can guess that I have no friends or lovers. I am completely alone, as was she. I stayed with her until the next full moon. We made love, sometimes on the altar, sometimes not. She was an amazing person, a beautiful person. But the moon called me away, as it has time and time again, to the most horrible massacre yet. That was when the police realized I was not dead, and the chase began anew all over the continent. I fled to Mexico and then found my way back through the States to Canada. But on the following year, I returned for another few weeks with Maxine and her ritual. This went on for another year, until now. This year I will not attend our reunion. I guess it doesn't matter, since it never worked. You cannot escape damnation. Our gods do not forgive or release us from our punishments. Stephen, after all these years, the police caught you so easily. Did you intend to be captured? Intend to? No, not exactly. I just got so tired of running, tired of hiding. I do not live, Doctor. I do not exist. I am no better than Maxine's brother, and I deserve to be bound and chained. I am the enemy of my own species. A cancerous body part in humanity's form, devouring it from the inside. I must be removed, or at least contained. Stephen, these fantasies that have controlled you for so long, can't you see that this is all illusion? You are the sick victim of a broken mind. A victim, perhaps. A broken mind, definitely. But I must stop, and I must rest. Please, just take me back to my cell. Lock me up. Besides, you'll see. 2 weeks from now, the moon will be full, Doctor, and you can witness my delusion for yourself. I just hope that modern science can handle proof of something like me. I suppose I will be studied, but I just don't care anymore. Maybe you can find a way to destroy me once and for all. That is all I will say. Get away from me. With that, Stephen Aldrey hung his head down and closed his eyes as if exhausted. The doctor gestured for the guards to take him, and with utmost caution they led him away to his cell. From the same door, a short man with carefully groomed brown hair and a mustache entered and sat down in the same spot where the killer had just sat moments before. "Well, Doc, what do you think?" he said snidely as he turned a pencil carelessly in his hands. "You heard him. He's completely lost in this fantasy." "Yeah, but is he going to get off on an insanity plea?" "It's possible. Doc, I've been trailing this bastard for 8 years. I've seen what he can do. This is all bullshit, and you know it. We got the next Manson here. We need names, Doc. He's got people out there under his spell. You know as well as I do that no one pulls off bloody massacres like that by themselves. You saw the pictures of that Mardi Gras. 20, 30 people, Doc. But no one's ever seen anyone else, Detective. For all we have on him, we don't have a single piece of evidence that points to anyone else. Keep at him. He'll talk. In the least, we've got to get the chair, Doc. This guy can't live. We can't let that happen. My job is not to get him one verdict or the other. I am here to understand him. Yeah, whatever. He'll be as crazy as him. I can't help but wonder, though. Wonder about what? About that house in Mississippi. I wonder if any of that's true. Some chick that he visits for sex a few times a year. It's probably just another messed up dream of his. Maybe. Stephen lay in his cot, his eyes closed and his heart filled with empty sadness. As he drifted to sleep, he thought of Maxine and longed to be with her one last time, to feel that connection one more time. "I miss you," he whispered to the darkness as he had so many times before. And then he began to dream. There was a voice from the void. "Stephen," it said, so distant and familiar. "Stephen, you must come." "Maxine," he said into the void. "Please help me. Please save me." "Maxine, what is it?" "We will be saved. But please, you must come now." "Maxine, I can't." "You must. You have to save us." Stephen awoke and sat up in his cot. His hands shook as he stared about the cell desperately. "I've got to get out of here," he whispered. He knew he must. He couldn't leave her, his friend, his one true love. Terror filled him with anxious, unrelenting anxiety. He stared at the door. How could he escape? It was 2 weeks before the full moon. "I need you," he screamed to the night. "You've tortured me for too long, you beast. Let me loose now. Please, come to me. Release me." There had to be a way. And then it came to him. He began to beat on the bulletproof glass of the cell. The lights flashed on, and the guard came yelling and shaking a nightstick. Stephen began beating his head against the glass, ramming and pounding until blood ran over his eyes. He punched and beat against the door until his hands were crushed. The guard set off an alarm, and all that came next faded into darkness as Stephen beat himself into unconsciousness. What happened? The doctor who had interviewed Stephen Aldrey, the full moon killer, but a few hours before, said, staring at the bloody unconscious form in the med center. "He just lost it. I think he must have been trying to kill himself. He just beat himself senseless before we even got into the cell. We'll restrain him and we'll examine him." The guard began to loop the straps over the killer's shoulders when suddenly The bloodied man leapt up and grabbed the doctor by her throat. "Just stop right there," he said coldly. As the guard stepped back and the other guards reached for their guns, Stephen held her head between his hands, poised with deadly calm, and more than capable of snapping her neck. "I don't want to hurt anyone." "Stephen, what are you going to do? You can't get out," she exclaimed as he pulled her back towards a door on the left. "We'll see. Medroom," he said to the nurse cowering in the far corner. "Stephen, what do you want?" "Open up the medroom." The nurse, quivering, took a key from her lab coat and unlocked the door. "Okay, Doc. Get me adrenaline." "What? Stephen, you can't be..." "Do it, Doc, and you'll get out of this," Stephen said, still holding her throat, as he backed slowly in. She carefully scanned the small bottles until she found a vial of adrenaline. "I've got it, Stephen." "Good. Fill a syringe and give it here." "Stephen, this could kill you," she said imploringly. "Do you care? Fill it." She did as she was asked. With a shaking hand, gave Stephen the syringe. "Stephen, please, can't we talk?" "I'm done talking. Now get out. I mean leave. Get out of the prison." And with that, he plunged the syringe into his chest and injected the entire dose. The doctor ran for the door as the guards radioed for support. "Come on out, Audrey. This is over," the guard shouted at the door. None of them could be seen in, but all heard the bizarre sounds that were drifting out. Stephen felt the surge coursing through his body like warm, liquid metal. "Come to me now. I need you," he whispered as the pain began, his pulse pounding. He looked down at his hands and saw the veins throbbing and growing. The shirt he wore began to tighten on his chest, and then the breaking sounds from his rib cage as his bones broke and healed larger and stronger. The sweet ache in his jaws increased, the blood running out from between his teeth as they grew and tore through his gums. "Run!" he screamed. "What the hell's going on in there?" "Oh no," the doctor whispered as the long, moaning howl of a lone beast echoed out from the room. The first gigantic clawed foot stepped into sight. The head with the blazing red eyes and monstrous dripping jaws came into view. And finally, they ran. They locked the door behind them, but it tore through the metal like cloth. They sprinted down the hall to the next security entrance, opening and closing the gate quickly, but the beast was set on its path and could not be halted. They watched in astonishment as the beast plowed through them and slammed into the barred window at the end of the hall, launching through the concrete, glass, and metal in an explosion before landing outside in the prison grounds, and then with the building speed of a charging locomotive demolished the outer fence. The werewolf had escaped. It traveled at a phenomenal speed across the countryside into the next state in hours. It found its way to the swamp and up the hidden road to the mansion. It started panting and heaving, thrashing down the doors and entering dripping with mud and swamp water into Maxine's chamber. The room was disrupted and in disarray but for the small infant that lay weeping in the bloodied blankets of the bed. The beast leaned down and sniffed the weeping infant. A noise from behind drew its focus to the back of the chamber. A form arose, hissing and snarling from the darkness. Maxine's green eyes now slitted and monstrous. Her clawed white hands tore at her throat. She had died in childbirth. "I cannot control it, Stephen," a voice in his mind screamed in torment. "He wants me to kill the baby. She is pure, Stephen. She is all that is left of us. He's going to make me do it. You must stop me." Within the beast there came despair, far deeper than any felt before. Within the monster, Stephen wept and screamed, and this scream became the howl of the demon wolf, and this sadness turned to rage. "Free me," Maxine called out from within the abomination she had become. The beast rose up and destroyed her, tearing and ripping as an unnatural red fire emanated from its jaws, consuming and destroying all that remained. He crossed back across the room and in its giant clawed hand lifted the tiny, trembling infant into its arms. As it cried and wailed in terror, he walked out from the room and left the house behind, carrying the newborn girl into the night. The child was found on the doorstep of the police station the next day. The police found the girl, which eventually was given to family services. Later that week, a man strapped with explosives went to the lake bordering the old Love Mansion and, standing on the levee, destroyed himself. The waters flooded the estate and left the entire area submerged. The mansion still stood, as did many of its ghosts. The child was pure. Therefore, the ritual had worked.